So I wrote a whole script for this thing some weeks ago about Jordan B. Peterson and his interesting problem with Sports Illustrated magazine putting a plus-size Asian model called Yumi Nu on the cover of their swimsuit issue for 2022. And, being me, I kind of lost interest in actually recording it once it was done, so I never did that one. But I'm kind of glad that I did, because I could never have guessed that he was, in fact, about to outdo himself. But before we go there, I want to start with something that happened to me. You may remember that a few weeks ago, the US Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade decision. And I don't think I need to go over that, because thousands of other people have already done so. One of whom was Stephen Crowder, who was delighted by the Roe v. Wade thing. Because he's a professional piece of shit, a racist, homophobe and misogynist hate-monger. And his gloating on Twitter bothered me to the point that I replied to one of his tweets about Roe v. Wade by telling him to perform a certain surgical operation on himself involving his testicles. I was not terribly surprised when I logged on to Twitter again the next day and found I'd been locked out of it for having said that, and I was basically told to delete the tweet if I wanted to be let back in. So I did. Twitter may be a shithole, but I find it a useful shithole. And frankly, I stand behind the sentiment, but I can't say I was overly bothered by having to delete my expression of it. Because I suppose I kind of was threatening Stephen Crowder with violence on the grounds of him being Stephen Crowder. And that's something that Twitter frowns upon. I can't honestly say I wasn't violating Twitter's terms of service, so I did the reasonable adult thing, deleted the tweet, and got on with life, such as it is. Which, frankly, makes me more of a reasonable adult than Jordan B. Peterson, PhD, who evidently believes his right to be pointlessly unpleasant beats the terms of service of a privately owned company. As you probably already know, Peterson lost his shit recently about transgender actor Elliot Page, who used to be female and gay, but about 18 months ago came out as a trans man, and had top surgery performed by a physician Peterson described on Twitter as criminal, while also dead-naming the actor. Which is another one of those things Twitter frowns upon. So Peterson has been touting this as Twitter banning him, even though they didn't as such, they just did what they did to me, i.e. told me to delete that tweet regarding Stephen Crowder's self-induced vasectomy, and then everything would go back to normal. Peterson's Twitter account is still up. You can't see the Elliot Page tweet because Twitter has blocked it, but all of Peterson's other gibberish is still there up to the day he was quote-unquote banned. We'll leave aside entirely the question of why Twitter took a week to do anything about Peterson's tweet and only a few hours to respond to mine. The important thing is how Peterson responded, which is to say he went off like the drama queen he fundamentally is in a 15-minute video rant about the situation, in the course of which he declared he would rather die than delete the offending tweet. Now, we knew that transphobia was a big thing for Peterson because it was his hysteria and lying over Canadian Bill C-16 and its legal protections for trans people that made him famous. But I didn't realise it was that important for him. Death indeed. In fairness to him, he does seem to have stuck to this promise, unlike his earlier promise to quit Twitter entirely after the Yumi Nu nonsense. But still. Now, Peterson was clearly a right-leaning shithead long before he became notorious for being one, and I get the feeling he's determined to just become even more so with age. Because a lot of his self-image seems bound up in the idea of him being a hard man. You can see that in quite a few parts of 12 Rules for Life, and it's there in his video response to Twitter. Because being hard means being better than other people, particularly women and trans folk. But Peterson's not a hard man except on paper. You can also see that in his video. All tough talk that sounds weirdly unnatural coming from him. It's just aggressive posturing by a pompous dickhead who doesn't know how to swear. And if anyone still doubted that Peterson was basically right-wing despite him pretending he's not, the news that he's signed up with the Daily Wire to do a video series for them should dispel those doubts. Taking Ben Shapiro's coin is not something an apolitical centrist does. Interestingly, however, this is apparently looking like a step too far for the Peterson cultists, as a recent video by The Tabernacle demonstrates. It looks like the lobster fandom is finally starting to see something in Glorious Leader that they don't like. At which point, I suppose we should bring up Peterson's adventures with benzodiazepines. Peterson infamously got hooked on benzos a few years ago, which culminated in him undergoing an ill-advised and frankly stupid rapid detox procedure. I'm actually not going to criticise him for that. I'm glad that he recognised he had a problem, and I approve of him trying to fix it, even if it was the wrong way to do so. Addiction and dependence is the sort of thing that could happen to any of us, and does happen to a lot of us. It came closer to happening to me some years ago than I like to admit, and so I don't criticise Peterson for just having had a chemical dependency like so many of us. But for a while there, we were left wondering just what effect Peterson's medical misadventures would have on him and his work, and the evidence suggests, frankly, not good things. Like I said, I won't criticise Peterson for having a benzo problem. I will criticise him for evidently not having learned anything from it. I mean, if nothing else, you'd think that coming as close to losing everything as Peterson did might have helped him realise what matters and what doesn't in the long run. What I've learned from my own experiences is that there's no value in being unpleasant to people that haven't done anything to deserve it. If they have done something, then, go for it, but there's no real point to just being an asshole for no good reason. If they're not hurting themselves or others, then maybe just leave people alone. But Jordan Peterson seems to have learned the opposite lesson, that needless assholery against people that haven't done anything except exist as themselves is in fact the most important thing he can give the world right now. And more than that, it has to be more aggressive and more vicious and more unnecessary than it already was. In another video he's posted recently, he characterises transgender surgery as, and these are his very words, Nazi medical experiment level wrong. Yeah, he just had to hit the Godwin switch. He's not even pretending that he's not a hateful piece of shit anymore. One of the original 12 rules was, be precise in your speech, but Peterson always made a point of being vague enough in the things he said that it was hard to pin him down exactly on where he stood. I think he's moved on from that, and anyone who still doubts what Peterson actually thinks just isn't paying attention. I can only assume the title of his next book of rules for life will be something like, Take the Mask Off, It's Not Fooling Anyone Anymore. Mind you, when I went for a look at Geordie's Twitter the other day, I did find one interesting thing on it. This is a quote from what I assume is himself, something that he's written, and I think it's actually really good. There really are few things worse than being in some sort of terrible situation and only having yourself to blame for it. I had a stroke in 2009, as I've mentioned before, which was basically the result of the diabetes and hypertension I'd suffered from for years, going unmedicated and therefore uncontrolled for several months. There are reasons why I went off those pills that I should have stayed on, but in the end the reasons don't matter, only the outcome. And really that outcome was my fault, and knowing that and admitting that has never made it easier to bear. I don't think Jordan Peterson will ever suffer from this, which is why there is a certain bitter irony in him having posted that quote, which, like I said, I presume is something he's said somewhere himself. I have seen other commentators describe this flare-up as Peterson having some sort of mental breakdown, maybe even as a result of his medical misadventures, which is possible, but personally, I'm not convinced. whatever may be driving him to this point, he's going along with it willingly and deliberately as far as I can see, and I think he knows perfectly what he's doing. This bullshit about Elliot Page is really his fault. He could just be an adult about it, take responsibility for what he said, and move on. Instead, it's the fault of Twitter, and Elliot Page, and queerness, and wokeness, and Marxism, and the dragon of chaos, and postmodernism, and the general degeneracy of Western civilization, and it's probably my fault as well on some level. It'll never be his. But it will be when more of his fans start realising Peterson is just a kind of shit human being and they discard him. And he'll be forgotten before long, and his legacy in the end will be even less positive than mine.